imaginary numbers. And before I start with the notes, let's talk about perfect squares. We know that 16 is a perfect square. Why?
4.
Because it's 4 times 4. Something is a perfect square when you multiply the same number by itself. So like 100 is a perfect square because 10 and 10. But what about negative 100? Is that a perfect square?
Yes.
What can I multiply by itself to get negative 100? But those are two different numbers. If you do a negative 10 and a positive 10, those are not the same number. What about if you did negatives? Negative 10 times negative 10. That gives you positive 100. So actually, it's not possible. You cannot take the square root of negative 100 because there's not a number you can multiply by itself. So that's where imaginary numbers come in. So one thing that you definitely need to know, you got to memorize this, kind of like, what's pi?
3.14.
3.14 dot 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 dot. You need to know that I is the square root of negative 1. I should say, what's I? And you should be able to tell me square root of negative 1.
It's me.
You're not imaginary.
No, I'm saying I is me.
Oh, I is me. And I squared, you don't, if we did, we're not going to do the back page of these notes. If we did, you would have to know that, but we're going to skip the back page. So let's remind ourselves of what we did in 5.6. I gave you this problem, the square root of 50. And I said to simplify that. Is 50 a perfect square? No. So if I typed it in the calculator, I would get a decimal. So what we did was we simplified it down, because I don't want you to give me a decimal answer. And you told me a perfect square that would go evenly into 50. What would that be? 25. 25 times what? 2. So since 25 times 2 is 50, I can split that up. Those are technically the same thing. But what do we know that the square root of 25 is? 5. And the square root of 2, you just leave it. So this is 5 square root of 2. We're going to be doing that same process with negative numbers. So if I'm going to start with the square root of negative 9. It is not 3. It is not negative 3. So when you have a negative under the square root, we are going to break it down, but the first time that we split it, we're going to do a negative 1 out by itself. Negative 1 times what is going to give me negative 9? 9.
But wouldn't that just,
So I can split this negative 9 into a negative 1 and a positive 9. Technically we're dividing. Okay. What is the square root of negative 1?
1.
Negative 1. 0.
I. The square root of negative 1 is I. Is 9 a perfect square? Yes. What is the square root of 9?
3.
3. So this is really I times 3, which we write it as 3i. So like normal variables, 3i. So the square root of negative 9 is 3i. Okay, number 2, I have the square root of negative 196. So I'm going to take the negative 1, and that's going to leave me with a positive 196. What is the square root of negative 1? I. Is 196 a perfect square?
No.
Yes.
It is. What is the square root of 196? 14. So this is really I times 14, which is 14I.
So what is this actually used for?
Well, our quadratics, the parabolas we've been talking about, our whole point of doing this is to find the x-intercepts. If I look at, like number 7, if I were to graph x squared plus 81, it's going to be like up here. So that one actually does not cross the x-axis. The x-intercepts are imaginary, technically. That's all that we're going to do with it.
So you would only ever use this if you graph stuff.
Yeah. All right, number 3. We have the square root of negative 5. So take out your negative 1, which leaves you with positive 5. And what is the square root of negative 1? I. Is 5 a perfect square? Nope. So it does not turn into a whole number. Is there a perfect square that goes into 5? That you can divide 5 by?
1.
1 is the only one. And if we do 1, we would be doing a never-ending loop of the same thing over and over. So if you can't divide it by anything, you just bring it down. So that doesn't change. The only thing that changed was basically the negative. I got rid of that and it became an I. Now here's the thing when we write our answer. If you have anything, any square root that's left, that needs to be wrote down at the very end. So I would write it as I square root of 5. The reason for that is it's hard to tell, especially with some of your handwriting, if you put the I afterwards, is the I under the square root or is it not? Some of you write so sloppy it'd be too hard to tell. So to avoid that, you just always put the I in front. And that's not just my rule, that's just how it always is. Are there any questions? Okay. Let's go down to number 4. So I have the square root of negative 80. So I'm going to do my negative 1, which leaves me with 80. What is the square root of negative 1? I. Is 80 a perfect square?
No.
Nope. Is there a perfect square that goes into 80? There is. So that means we have to split the 80 up. So I want to know what the largest perfect square is that goes into 80. So I'm going to do 80 divided by 64. So we're taking the perfect squares, that the right column. 80 divided by 49. No. 80, keep going up, divided by 36. 80 divided by 25. 80 divided by 16. That gives me a whole number. So that's the one I'm going to use. 16 and 5. And what is the square root of 16? 4. And then the other one, just bring it down because there's nothing else you can do. So my answer, we start with the whole number, then I, then the square root that's left. 4i square root of 5.
Where'd the odd, or not the odd, 5 come from?
Because back up here, I know that, well, 16 times,
Oh,
and then, so those are square roots still, and the square root of 16 is 4. But the square root of 5, I can't do anything else with that. So I just leave it. Number 5, we're going to take the negative 1 out, leaving 32. We had 32 was in our last notes. It was a question on your test, and now you're seeing it again. What is the square root of negative 1?
I.
Hi. Is 32 a perfect square? No. So split it. What is the largest perfect square that goes into 32?
16.
16 times what?
2.
2. And what is the square root of 16? 4. Can I do anything with the square root of 2?
No.
Nope, so bring it down. So 4i square root of 2. Try number 6 on your own. So you should have started by getting the negative 1 and then the 192. We know that the square root of negative 1 is I. 192 is not a perfect square, so you have to split it up. 64 and 3. And the square root of 64 is 8. The last one, leave it down. So 8i square root of 3. Is there anything right now that you just don't understand? If you missed lesson 5.6, that would be harder. 5.6 is we did this whole process. Okay. So you should have seen this already, just without the negative 1. So just like we did in 5.6, we're going to have some equations where we solve for x. So start by drawing a line. What would my first step be? Subtract 81. Good. And that gives me x squared equals negative 81. How do I get rid of the squared?
You square the x.
You square root. Yep. So a square root and a squared undo each other. So you got to square root both sides. And so now I'm working with the square root of negative 81, which is a problem like these up here. So I take out my negative 1, leaving me with an 81. And what is the square root of negative 1? I. Is 81 a perfect square?
Yes.
Yeah. What is the square root of that? 9. So x equals, do you remember what we had to put in our answers in 5.6? The plus or minus. So plus or minus 9i. technically on the ones where you're actually solving an equation, you're supposed to put that. Your test, when you have a test over this, it's going to be multiple choice. So if you don't put it, it's not the end of the world. So let's go to number 8. What should I do first? Subtract 9, which gives me 2x squared equals negative 8. Then what? There's still a 2 in the front, so you have to divide by 2. And that gives us x squared equals negative 4. Then what? Now I can take the square root. Got to do the negative 1. And I have a 4. What is the square root of negative 1? I. What's the square root of 4?
2.
2. So my answer, x equals plus or minus 2i. Are there any questions? Number 9. Subtract 15. And we get 4x squared equals negative 24. And then what? Divide by 4 to get x squared equals negative 6. And then I take the square root. So when I take the square root, since there's a negative number, you've got to take out the negative 1. That gets rid of the negative. And that leaves me with a positive 6. What is the square root of negative 1? I. Is 6 a perfect square?
Nope.
Nope. So I need to figure out if I can split it up. Is there a perfect square that goes evenly into 6? Nope. So I can't split it. I just leave it. So plus or minus I square root of 6. I want you to try number 10. So you should subtract 13. Which gives you x squared equals negative 12. And there's nothing to divide by, so I can go ahead and take the square root. So I got my negative 1, and I got my 12. So I know this is I. And 12 is not perfect, but I am able to split it up. Square root of 4, square root of 3. And I know that the square root of 4 is 2. And the other one I can't do anything with. So it's x equals plus or minus 2I square root of 3. Are there any questions?